A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's now 5 p.m. in the UK where I am, so I think we're about ready to start. My name is Laura. I work for Practical Action, and I'm pleased to say I'm probably one of the UK's least successful home gardeners. I'm also a houseplant hoarder. So you will be very pleased to hear that over the next hour, we're going to hear instead from our two wonderful guests who are ready to share their expertise with us. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be talking about Practical Action's work to promote sustainable and regenerative agriculture across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where we work. And we'll also be hearing more about how the same thinking and some of the techniques, we hope, can be applied in our own gardens, allotments, and green spaces closer to home. And now I'd love to introduce you to our guests. With us this afternoon, we have Unelka Mauga. Unelka is also a Practical Action staff member, and she grew up on a farm in Western Kenya, where she first learned about agriculture from her grandma. Her grandma sounds like a bit of a trailblazer. Back in the 1980s, she won a national award in Kenya for innovative intercropping, which I now know is a very beneficial practice of growing multiple different crops simultaneously on the same field. Inspired by her roots, her family, and her deep love for people and for nature, Unelka became a passionate conservationist and a community developer. She studied environmental science, earning a master's in environment and international development from the University of Edinburgh. Unelka is especially curious about two things in particular: how renewable energy can open up new opportunities for women, and how regenerative agriculture can help farmers build more resilient landscapes for themselves. She's previously worked in wildlife conservation as a National Geographic Explorer and Worldwide Fund for Nature Africa ambassador. Today, Unelka is part of our global team at Practical Action, where she works as our agriculture and energy officer. Her role is really about supporting our teams across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to co-create smart, sustainable solutions with the communities we work with. So a huge thanks to Unelka for joining us today. We can't wait to hear more from you. Our next guest is Tom Massey. Tom is based in London, where he designs the most amazing gardens for private and commercial clients, as well as for festivals and shows across the world. I'm sure you know his work. Tom grew up in London and spent his childhood exploring Richmond Park with long summer holidays in rural Cornwall. Those are the sort of experience that would certainly spark a deep love of the natural world for him. After studying animation at the Arts University Bournemouth, Tom went down a range of creative paths from advertising to events, but was eventually drawn to study landscape design at the London College of Design. You may know him now as an award-winning garden designer who just won his second gold medal at this year's Chelsea Flower Show, so massive congratulations, Tom. You may also know him as the author of the RHS Resilient Garden book, which is all about garden design in response to climate change and ways we can adapt and build resilience for the future. His work is all about creating ecologically beneficial, sustainable gardens that promote biodiversity and support valuable wildlife. So we couldn't think of a better person to join us at Practical Action for our conversation today. And now over to our guests, hoping you are there. Tom, you're passionate about creating sustainable gardens that promote biodiversity and support wildlife. Why? Can you tell us a bit about how that's a guiding principle for you? And has that always been the case since you started working with gardens?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you touched on it in your introduction. I was lucky to grow up near Richmond Park and in a part of London that has lots of green space all around. So I think I'd always been a keen gardener myself. My mum got me into gardening from a very young age, from about 2. I think I was out in the garden, had a little patch I could call my own. We had a small allotment, so, we're growing fruit and vegetables. And I think that early connection to the natural world really stayed with me as I grew older, as I explored different interests. As you said, I studied animation. So I kind of diverged from landscapes and gardening into art and design, studied animation, and then came back to landscape design in slightly later life. And I think one of the things that did draw me back was the deepening climate emergency, you know, the lack of green space, the loss of green space, the decline of species, just seeing the natural world, you know, declining and suffering in front of our eyes. I think I wanted to work in a field, well, metaphorical and literal, where you could make a difference. So I've been practicing for 10 years now, and through the course of my time working in this industry, I've really tried to learn, develop, innovate, you know, gain experience from as many different areas as possible. And that's something that, yeah, as you said, I've written a book called The Resilient Garden, and I've just finished a second book called Water-Wise Garden, all about gardening in extremes of too much or too little water, which most of us know in this country, you know, we face quite regularly throughout the year. So yeah, it's always been an interest of mine, and something that I feel very passionate about.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I think that feeling of watching wildlife decline before our eyes is something that resonates with many of us. We can all remember buddleia bushes covered in butterflies when we were kids that are no longer covered in the same butterflies. So your work there is really important. We're going to be talking more about water preservation later. And now to Onelka. Onelka, could you give us a bit of an overview of Practical Action's work in regenerative agriculture and tell us why it's so important for the people we work with and for the planet?
Yes, so to begin with, I'd like to paint a picture that explains why agriculture matters. In the developing world, roughly 60 to 80% of people rely on farming, either directly or indirectly, for their livelihoods, and that's around 5 billion people we're talking about in low to middle income countries who are involved in farming in some way. Many of them work the land every single day. So as many may know, Practical Action focuses on working with vulnerable communities, with people living in poverty, and based off of World Bank statistics, 78% of the world's extreme poor rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. So this is why farming matters to us. The World Economic Forum estimates that 600 million people are smallholder farmers. So we work with smallholder farmers for that reason, and majority of them are marginalized and living in poverty. These farmers are the backbone of our local and global food systems because they export the food globally, and their way of life, sadly, is under threat. There are two major forces that are working against them. One of them, which Tom mentioned, was the climate emergency. And the second is the use of harmful chemicals and pesticides in farming practices because they degrade the land they depend on. So our focus is on tackling these issues. Our approach is to use regenerative agriculture, which aims to turn this around by supporting smallholder farmers, especially those that are at the front lines of the climate crisis, to rebuild their soil, to restore biodiversity, to grow food in ways that are good for both people and the planet. So through our funded programs, we practically help farmers to build resilience through climate smart farming. We help them gain sustainable income sources from farming by linking them to the right markets so that they can lift themselves out of poverty. And we also help them adopt sustainable practices that improve their livelihoods, practices that will keep them farming for generations to come. And we know that the green revolution that took place in the 80s meant that many farmers adopted chemical intensive farming. So for the last 20, 30 years, we've been degrading our soil with chemicals. And so what we do at Practical Action is that we help farmers transition from chemical intensive farming to farming that is more nature friendly or nature based. And we do this in 4 ways. The first is that our approach is farmer centered. We make sure that farmers are at the heart of designing and and inventing the practical farming techniques that they adopt. We collaborate with local partners, with academia, with local governments, and with the private sector in the countries that we work in. Thirdly, we build an evidence base. We make sure that our work is incorporating soil testing or geomapping or participatory surveys. And this helps us generate the data that drives smart and relevant decisions. And finally, we scale. So we make sure that our approach is easy to adopt across contexts without the need for extra funding. So trying our best to make it sustainable. So with these 4 principles, we make sure that farmers are at the heart of what we do, and that in all our country offices and agriculture programs, we are collaborating, we are building evidence, and we're scaling. And finally, Laura, what's powerful, I think, about our regenerative agriculture work is that it puts the future back into the hands of farmers. It's not just about sustaining what they have now. It's about regenerating landscapes. It's about improving farming techniques. It's about strengthening communities. And in the face of a climate emergency, that kind of transformation is extremely necessary.
Thanks, Inelka. I'm so with you there. The key to what we do, as you say, is our solutions are rooted in local context, using local knowledge, and they're built around the people who are facing the challenges of, you know, a changing climate and a difficult economy. And what works is that those solutions will be, sorry, the lights go off in this room if you don't move. There we are. Those solutions are going to last after practical action has left the picture. They will be there for generations to come, and that means that they are going to work. Thank you so much for talking a bit about some of the work Practical Action is doing in the field of agriculture. Yet again, no pun intended, and we will try and avoid that throughout the talk. So with that in mind, we'd like to show you a short film about how reliable access to water is making a difference for one of the many communities we work with in Nepal. Thank you.
जलवायुले असर त पारिराखेको छ भनेको समयमा पानी नै पर्दैन पानी पर्यो भने नि एकदम क्षतिहरू गर्ने असिनाहरू पर्ने अनि कहीं बाढी पहिरो नै भत्काइदिने त्यस्तो भइराछ
अहिलेकै तुलना गर्दाखेरि यो समयमा पानीको एकदम अभाव थियो यसलाई पनि मध्यनजर गरेर त्यसलाई कसरी अनुकूलता बनाउने अब बजारको माग के छ
पछि समुन्नति परियोजनाले नि पानी दिनु भयो अनि हामीले पनि अलिअलि अब आफ्नो सरमहरू गरेर अहिले चाहिँ पर्याप्त मात्रामा पानी छ अनि पानीबाट नै अब सबै तरकारी खेतीहरू सबै भइरहेछ बजारदेखि किन्ने ल्याउने खाने गर्थ्यौं अनि अहिले चाहिँ पानी भएदेखि अब मोटरहरू लगाउने बेच्ने
What a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's wonderful to hear about how a community in Nepal uses our support to get a solar-powered pump installed, which is something they lead on. And it just produces great results for a whole community of smallholder farmers. I really loved hearing how they're now producing and selling their own crops instead of just buying them in or producing a few bits for themselves. That is a success story, and it's one that is going to last. So thinking about water, Tom, you mentioned that your new book is going to be focusing a lot about water resilient gardening. And I think we'd probably all like to ask you for some tips on how we can harvest and conserve water in our gardens and allotments for the, you know, the driest times. But as you said, we'd also like to ask you what we should be planting that's resilient to the extremes of both drought and rainfall that we see these days. It's something we're experiencing a lot in the UK. I'm pretty sure this time last year was one of the wettest on records, whereas I'm sitting here in an office that's about 25 degrees. And, you know, we've been through numerous heat waves this summer. How can we possibly garden in a way that is resilient to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge, and I actually got a copy. So this is the second book, which is coming out in September. But this book goes through. It's called RHS Waterwise Garden, and it's published by DK, and it goes through everything from the global problem. You know, what is the water? What is the water crisis? What are we facing? What are the problems? The global problems, but then focusing down onto, you know, London and the UK and individuals, what can we all do in our own gardens to help conserve water and to be more water wise, and why that's important as well. You know, why do we need to do that? And there's some quite stark facts. You know, we often think that these kinds of problems are, you know, relegated to other parts of the world, that here in the UK, you know, we have enough rainfall and that's just, you know, we have all the water that we need when we need it. But with climate change, you know, we are also being impacted and rainfall is becoming more sporadic. I think this has been the driest spring ever recorded in the UK. So, you know, our water reserves, the way that we see and value water does really need to change. And there's some pretty hard-hitting facts. You know, London and lots of other major cities around the world might actually run out of water, as in water will stop coming out of taps because, you know, demand is too high, ancient infrastructure is too leaky. You know, people just don't value water and use it in a way that it's just like a commodity that can just be, you know, washed away. So the book really seeks to help reframe that and position water as this really valuable resource that we need to really think about and care about. And it talks about the different ways in which rainfall, you know, a free resource, can be captured. So there are things that most people know: water butts and rainwater harvesting tanks. These are called active rainwater harvesting. So you actively have to retrieve the water from a tank or a butt with a tap or a pump. There are other systems that are called passive systems. So kind of like in the video, you know, systems where you're irrigating the land using gravity. So allowing water to move through your landscape and be held in swales, which are channels, or ephemeral ponds or rain gardens, and allow it to slowly percolate into the soil rather than just running off and causing localized flooding or overwhelming main sewers, which you know, then get overwhelmed and discharges of raw sewage occur in our rivers and waterways. So it really seeks to show that, you know, even if you have a small garden, everyone can make a difference if you really reframe the way that we see water, the way that we value rainwater, and the way that we allow water to move through our landscapes. And there, as you highlighted, there's kind of planting conditions for all types, from very dry to very wet, and in between, you know, that fluctuating condition. And I think really my main piece of advice, rather than just giving individual plants, which I never think is that helpful because everyone's garden is different, my main advice would be to really think about your garden, think about the conditions that it faces now and that it might face in the future, and don't try and achieve a scheme, a planting design that is completely at odds with the garden that you have. So if you live on on a coastal, exposed, full sun location, don't try and plant a woodland garden. And if you live in the middle of a wood, you know, it's very shady and damp, don't try and plant a Mediterranean garden. You know, think about the context and adapt your planting, adapt your design to suit those conditions.
Thanks, Tom. What you say makes perfect sense. And I do see probably more local councils and authorities forcing plants that shouldn't really be there, you know, planting roses and bedding plants in the hottest conditions or in places that are subject to flood, and it just makes no sense. So as you say, I think leaning into the conditions of your own garden is the way forward. Presumably, relying on plants that really belong in that environment is going to do wonders for biodiversity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a very good point. You know, you see, I guess as a society, we're quite slow to accept change. So, you know, people want to see roses, they want to see hydrangeas, they want to see native trees and shrubs being specified, but we're not really gardening in a static time. You know, the climate is changing so rapidly that many of the native trees that we have come to know and love, things like silver birch. We do a lot of work with the City of London, and they're no longer planting silver birch, our native birch, in the city because it just struggles too much with the heat and the dry. So already, you know, in the 10 years I've been practicing, I'm seeing changes in the kinds of things that we can plant and that we can sustainably grow in this country. And that's happening all over the world, where we're coming from a kind of lower baseline of a kind of tolerable climate, but in other parts of the world it's becoming so extreme that conditions are much more unbearable. But we can also glean information from other parts of the world. London by 2050 is expected to be more like Barcelona. So looking at what grows well in Barcelona now, the kinds of species that are thriving and doing well, and applying some of that thinking to London conditions, with the caveat that London is still much wetter in the winter. That kind of global research and sharing of information can be really valuable. And I think that's where social media does have a very has a real kind of purpose and a benefit. It's that sharing of stories, gardener to gardener across the world. What's doing well, what can we learn? And like in the video that was just shown, taking techniques from regenerative agriculture or from communities that are facing very extreme conditions now. What are they doing? How are they adapting? And how can we apply that even in our gardens here in the UK?
Great. Thank you, Tom. And you've brought us nicely to the next short story we're going to be showing. We're going to head back to Nepal now for a bit of a film. Oh, lights have gone again. Sorry. It's excellent way of conserving energy, but it's a pain if you sit still. Sorry, we're going back to Nepal now for another short film. It's going to show us how improving soil health, which is something we'll be talking about shortly, is working for a small farming community. So with that, over to the video. Thank you.
अब यिनी मलका कुरा भयो, पुनः कम्पोस्ट मल भयो, अनि जैविक विषादी जैविक झोल मल भयो। यिनी तरिका त अब कसैलाई पनि थाहा छैन। नभएको कारणले चाहिँ मैले चाहिँ सिकेको अनुसार चाहिँ मैले सिकाइरहेको छु र उहाँहरूले ज्ञान अलिकति लिइराख्नु भएको छ।
हाम्रो कम्पोस्ट मल हालेकोमा योत्खन गर्न सजिलो, एकदम सजिलो र माटो कडा नहुने। अब त्यो गोबर मल प्रयोग गरिसकेपछि अलरेडी गडौलाहरू पनि खेतहरूमा प्रशस्त मात्रामा हुन्छ। हामीले त्यहाँ रासायनिक कुनै चिज प्रयोग गर्ने पाइएन। गडौलाले त्यो हुई पनि गडौला हुन्छ।
Within विकासमा चाहिँ नापको वडा तन्त निलागत आदि बिस्तारै बिस्तारै लक्ष्य खाको रासायनिक मल र कम्पोस्ट मल
I hope you all enjoyed that very intimate close-up of a worm there. I've seen the video before, wasn't expecting it again. For me, the bit that really works about that story is how Basant and Lal are sharing the knowledge they've learned with as many people as they can. So they're making sure that the benefits of that naturally enriched soil are experienced as widely as possible within and outside their community. That's how great ideas are spread. So let's talk about soil then. More than a third of the world's soil is already degraded. And according to the UN, this is going to rise to 90% of soil degradation by 2050 if nothing is done about it. So with that in mind, it's really important that we take a look at the ground beneath our feet. Unelka first, is soil health something that farmers are talking about enough in the places we work?
So, to answer your question about the importance of soil, firstly, before I speak about whether farmers are doing enough about it, I think, unfortunately, soil doesn't get enough attention or the attention that it deserves. It's deteriorating globally at a very fast pace, and the statistic you just shared makes that very clear. And the reason why soil degradation is a huge concern is because it has a direct impact on food security globally. No one is immune. If we have no soil, we have no food. And sadly, there are no projections yet about when things will begin to change, which is worrying because it means that not enough research and action has been taken to change the status quo. So about 2 years ago, we did a study with BioVision in Kenya, which is a country known for to be a huge exporter of food to Europe. And the reality we had to face while we conducted the research was that approximately 90% of farmland in the country is considered deficient in organic matter, and the productivity of key crops is significantly lower when compared to other African countries. And that's just a glimpse of how bad the situation is. So I think that over the last few years, people and farmers have started to recognize that this is a ticking time bomb. And the way in which people are responding is by understanding why we got here in the first place. Why is soil degraded? And practically speaking, a lot of soil degradation comes about due to overcultivation or overgrazing. And in our programs, it's generally overcultivation that we're mostly interested in. How are people digging their soil? Because how you take care of soil affects the level of nutrients and organic matter that soil has. So if soil isn't conserved, it means organic matter is being taken out faster than it's being returned. So we worry about the level of nutrients and organic matter in the soil, and we also worry about the amount of chemical fertilizer that is being put into the soil. There are many concerns more recently about the food we eat, whether it's clean or laced with a lot of chemicals. So many people around the world are increasingly becoming conscious of the food we eat, how it was grown, and what we put in our soils determines how clean organic our food is. So to answer your question about what's happening at the ground to protect soil, through our programs, we focus on training farmers to adopt regenerative farming techniques that protect the soil rather than degrade the soil. And I'll share a few approaches for the audience, and these are some approaches that we have under our agriculture toolkit. One of them is to make sure that you're not tilling the soil too much, in the same way that a good baker knows not to overbeat the batter. We are also encouraging farmers to adopt circularity. We've heard a lot about composting, I hope, putting food waste back into the farm. We are working with farmers to also grow all sorts of vegetation in the farm plot, or grow multiple crops in a farm plot, so that we're supporting biodiversity and attracting all sorts of animal and plant life. And another technique is to reduce the use of fertilizer, replace it with natural fertilizer, with biopesticides, and with bioherbicides. So these are a few practical approaches anyone can implement. And in our programs, we work with farmers at the start of a project to examine their farming landscape, determine what farmers are struggling with, what they need to improve, and then co-design techniques that are suitable for their context. And we typically work with them over a 5-year period to support what we call their transition to regenerative agriculture. And as we saw in the video, Basant was part of one of our projects in the western lowlands of Nepal. We've been working over the last 10 years with the Nepali government to conduct soil testing with smallholder farmers through collaborative action research. And Basant was a member of the farmer field schools that we established to help farmers adopt composting and reduce dependence on chemical fertilizer. And what we've seen, the results we've seen, as we saw in the video, is that farmers are harvesting even more, and they're earning an income, they're earning more money. So in the long run, we are witnessing livelihood development. Their livelihoods are better than they were before because of regenerative agriculture.
Thank you very much, Nelka. And as you say, when people's livelihoods are better, it's an extra incentive to follow the advice in things like our agricultural toolkit, which is something I long to see, actually. It sounds practical and like something that could perhaps give us advice for our own green spaces at home. Tom, I'd like to ask you the same question, really. Is soil health something that is being talked about enough in gardening? So, for example, is it something your clients think about when they're asking you to design gardens for them?
I think it isn't, but it's changing. I think it's something that people are becoming more aware of. I don't know if anyone went to a really good exhibition at Somerset House recently called Soil, which is all about the soils. It had lots of different multimodal artists and designers and practitioners exhibiting information about the soil, but just showing how incredibly rich, how full of life, how important it is to everything that we rely on. So I think soil is having a kind of it's sort of on the edge of a resurgence. You know, people are starting to see soil as something that is living, is vital, is part of our ecosystem. And there's lots of movements like Charles Dowding and no dig, no dig gardening, essentially not digging the soil at all in order to preserve all the life. Kind of as Inarka was saying, the more you dig it, the more you disturb it, the more you're damaging the structure and the life that takes a long time to build up. And as for clients, definitely clients are becoming more aware of these kinds of things, and the more that we talk to them about often it's not a kind of desire not to do it, it's just a lack of knowledge, that soil is important, and specifying the right soil, or leaving protecting the soil during a build is a really important thing to do. So I think in answer to your question, it's not being talked about enough right now, but there's a growing swell of interest, and I think that will build over time.
Thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier, I am a deeply unsuccessful gardener. And one of the things I was always taught is to turn the soil over every year, get your fork in, give it a good disturbing, and maybe enrich it with manure or that sort of thing. So the idea of not digging it is very interesting to me. Do you have any other quick tips for us as sort of home gardeners, allotment growers, and so on, about how we can improve the quality of our soil in these domestic green spaces?
Yeah, well, no dig is, like you say, it's the kind of ultimate for a gardener who doesn't want to have to do too much. Which is myself a bit. Often when you're in the garden, you want to you want to enjoy yourself and not necessarily be digging over an entire bed.
Right.
So you can add organic matter without digging it in. Just add it in thinner layers, so a couple of centimeters, 3 or 4 times a year, and it will decompose and be taken down into the soil by all the soil organisms and all the life. I mean, making your own compost at home is always a no-brainer. If you don't have a compost heap and you've got space, then make one. If you don't have a lot of space, there are lots of good products. Like there's one called the hot bin composter, which is a bit smaller than a wheelie bin, and it gets really hot, so it makes compost quicker than a traditional heap. So, composting is kind of a no-brainer, because you're stopping waste going off-site, you're composting it on-site, and then you're adding it back to your garden to enrich the soil. So yeah, say take up no dig and try making your own compost as 2 quick things that you can do that are minimal effort and maximum reward.
I am all about the minimal effort. Thank you, Tom. That's fantastic. We're going to head now to Kenya to meet one of the farmers Practical Action have worked with. She's called Laureen, and I've actually had the pleasure of meeting her myself in person. So I'm really pleased that you'll get to hear from her briefly now with another short film.
All begins from you as an individual. You have to have passion, be passionate with what you want in life. And my great thanks goes to Practical Action for teaching us how to go green without use of chemicals. After the training, we don't interfere with the lives of the animals here. So that's what we do, and observe how this environment can serve both the human beings and the animals. I produce my own fertilizer from my vermiculture project. I'm able to spray that onto my leafy vegetables, and I don't now eat chemicals.
for that. So just to reiterate that the goo that you saw dripping from Laureen's vermiculture tanks there is really fantastic, she told me. If you spray it on your leafy green vegetables, it keeps the pests off. And it's a completely natural substance. She also told me what it was called. I was expecting that it would have, you know, a technical name or some kind of industry brand, but actually she calls it worm juice. So she's obviously got a stronger stomach than me. And now, thinking of worms and bugs and other forms of animal life that we want to encourage, I'd like to ask you, Tom, just in your own words, why is biodiversity so important? And also, what can we do as gardeners and allotment owners to nurture a good, healthy balance of species in our gardens?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, we need to really look at our gardens not as individual things that we own, but interconnected landscapes that can, you know, if we all change the way in which we garden, allow more space for wildlife, you know, plant a higher diversity of species, encouraging more insects, you know, allow different types of habitat, then I think in the UK, the amount of gardens, private gardens, equates to a landmass the size of around Wales, you know, the entirety of Wales. So if you think about that, if that's all concrete and paving and hard materials and you know, plastic furniture, then it's not really going to do. It's going to have a negative impact. If we allow even 50% of that space to be a bit more wild, full of habitat, full of biodiversity, it's going to make a big difference, you know, across the country. So I think thinking about our gardens as interconnected landscapes, as corridors for wildlife is really important. I think one of the reasons why biodiversity is important is for resilience. So, you know, a higher degree of biodiversity, the more species there are, the more resilient that garden or that ecosystem will be in the face of the climate emergency. You know, the more food for pollinators, the more species that might bounce back or adapt. So yeah, biodiversity and resilience really go hand in hand. And how to do it? I mean, just allowing, it could be as simple as allowing a part of your garden to be a bit more wild if you have space, you know, or letting your lawn grow long, not mowing it so often, allowing some of the flowering species to emerge. And maybe also just rethinking, reframing what you see as acceptable, you know, from a kind of tidiness perspective, how tidy, how clipped, how formal, how sprayed does your garden need to be? You know, could you allow a few leaves to be a bit more nibbled? Could you allow a few weeds or you know, plants in the wrong place to appear? So I think there's so many answers to that question, but essentially just maybe be a bit more relaxed with the way that you garden.
I couldn't agree more. This year I've left seed heads on things like my aqualegias and my alliums, rather than snipping them off for tidiness. And the amount of species that now call those sort of dead heads and seed pods home is beautiful. And that again is about me being less manicured. Unelka, I'd like you to tell us a bit about how practical action supports farmers to increase biodiversity in some of the places we work.
Yes, so typically one might be tempted to think that we don't work in biodiversity or to boost biodiversity, because a lot of the stories we tell are about smallholder farmers. But when you think about us working with smallholder farmers, multiple smallholder farmers, then we go beyond one farming plot and we're talking about a community, we're talking about a landscape of farms. So in that way, we recognize that we're not just working within a farming plot, but we're also influencing and changing landscapes. So as an environment and development organization, a lot of our work over the past decade has been about transforming landscapes. Some of our recent work to boost biodiversity is reflected in a flagship program in Latin America, our Biodiverse Landscapes project, which is implemented in the Andes Amazon region, which is a region of the Amazon forest that spans across both Peru and Ecuador. And this is a UK government Biodiverse Landscape Fund project, an ambitious 6-year program that runs up until 2029. And we're working across vast areas. We're talking about 11 million hectares, one of the most biodiverse and ecologically critical regions in the planet. And our work under this project is to help protect isolated patches of the forest in the Amazon. And we're doing this with indigenous farming communities. We are working at a landscape scale. Working in a forest demands that you work at a landscape scale. And our goal is to help restore degraded land. And how we do that is to make sure that farmers are aware about regenerative practices. Farmers aren't tempted to deforest trees because crops are failing. So our goal is to make sure that farming is sustainable within forests and to work with indigenous communities. Gabriela, for example, who is based in our Latin American office, is now working with indigenous communities to design techniques that they want to use for alternative crop that we can help them link to markets. And a quick example of some of the crop and techniques that we're helping them adopt is agroforestry in coffee and cocoa farms. So typically, if you're talking intensive coffee farming, you have a field of coffee alone. But if you want to make that successful in a forest setting, then you have to convince farmers to incorporate the natural landscape. So that involves planting rows of trees within coffee farms. And this helps to protect the soil and reduce any pressures on the forest. And we're also helping create sustainable crop value chains. So crop that wouldn't typically be popular among farmers, we're helping farmers to consider alternative crops so that they don't cut down trees. And we're helping them get links to the right market for that crop. And lastly, we are also helping encourage, together with WWF, who are a partner in the consortium, we are helping to build natural corridors so that wildlife can roam freely between ecosystems. We don't want farmers to have the mindset that my farm is mine and to be oblivious of the fact that wildlife roams through these landscapes. So changing mindsets about land ownership and making and pushing the narrative for communal land to protect critical species that are under threat of survival. So that's just one classic example of ongoing work that we have that has a focus on landscape restoration and that protects biodiversity. I'd like to end by saying that boosting biodiversity for us is about transforming entire landscapes, not just for wildlife, but for the people. So making sure that they're implementing regenerative systems so that their ecosystems are restored, so that their livelihoods are sustained, and making sure that historically excluded communities, such as indigenous communities, can still thrive in the wake of climate change, in the wake of species loss, and adopt farming that is sustainable.
Thanks, Inalka. One of my favourite things about the Biodiverse Landscapes project in the Andes Amazon region that you spoke about is just that it sees it, although the area in question spans a number of political country borders, we're not seeing it like that. As you say, it is one valuable piece of land that must be seen as such, and you know, it's irreplaceable. It's a fantastic piece of work, which of course you can read more about on our website. So thank you, Tom and Inalka. We've heard a lot about the kind of practices we can implement in our own green spaces, and also the real importance of us all taking action to make a positive difference. And now is the time to share some questions that our lovely audience have sent to us with Tom and Inalka. I've been handed a piece of paper, and I'm going to try and address these questions to the person I think who will give us a great answer. So To start with, one of our audience had asked, how clean is our rainwater? I feel that that's perhaps one for Tom, in light of your new book coming out.
Yeah, I think so. Acid rain rain has become less acidic than there was a time where we were burning a lot of coal in this country, and that was really causing a big problem with acid rain. So rainfall now is, I guess clean is hard to answer, but maybe let's talk about it in terms of what plants prefer. So rainfall is a bit more acidic than tap water, which is often quite alkaline because of all the treatment process it goes through. And tap water often has lots of residual chemicals and minerals within it. So if you use it regularly on plants, particularly house plants in a confined pot, that can build up as deposits in the soil. So plants do actually prefer rainwater. The acid, the mild acidity helps dissolve nutrient, and it has less mineral deposit in it. So yeah, rain is good. It's better for planting if you can capture it and water your plants with rainfall.
Thanks, Tom. Another question that's been sent to us, I think this one will be for Inelka. Are there any examples in Practical Action's work where communities in Africa, Asia, or Latin America have actually changed what they're growing to suit new climatic conditions?
Yeah, we have a few examples, mainly in Africa and in Latin America. So I'll start off with Latin America. I mentioned Peru. We are working with farmers in Peru to practice what we call hillside coffee farming. So for farmers who were practicing monocropping, the practice of just growing one crop, we are encouraging them to combine coffee farming with tree farming. As I mentioned previously, agroforestry with coffee farming. So you might think it's just planting trees in a coffee farm, but if you plant fruit trees, then you have an income source for farmers because they can sell the fruit. So that's been an example of alternative crop that farmers previously weren't aware of, and they have now new markets and additional income. In Africa, two examples. One is in Malawi, in northern Malawi. 2 years ago, we implemented a Powering Renewable Energy for Agriculture Livelihoods project with women farmers in the north, which is a very dry part of the area. We worked with local partners to set up greenhouses to enable women to practice tomato farming. They previously did not plant or farm tomatoes in the region, but through using improved agriculture techniques, they were able to grow tomatoes in their greenhouses. And then the last example I'll share is from our work in Sudan. We implemented a regreening project in a desertified landscape. So those of you who are not familiar with Sudan is considered a desert because it's very close to the Saharan desert in the Sahel region. And what we did with farmers there was to encourage them to grow sorghum and millet, which are very drought resilient crop. So those have been examples of crop that we have introduced to farmers through our work, and we have success stories on our website covering them.
Thanks, Sunelka. I remember also a wonderful piece of work we did about growing potatoes in Kassala in Sudan, which was an incredible achievement because, as you say, the soil is dry and arid, and it's not somewhere potatoes are particularly happy. But it seems to work very well for the smallholder farmers there who now have a value chain they can take to market. So it's a fantastic set of work we're doing in Sudan. Please, everyone, do head to the website and learn more about it. It's all the more impressive because it's dealing with an ongoing conflict in the country, which makes everything a million times harder for those involved. Another question we have, I'm going to address this one to Tom. Is there a place for hydroponics or growing inside at different levels?
Yeah, I think there's always a place for any kind of innovation, and hydroponics features in my book actually as a good way to show a kind of closed loop system. So it's very water efficient. You recirculate the water. You do need to add feed, and you need to check that the water is you need to replace the water after a time. But yeah, hydroponics are really interesting, and I think will increasingly. I mean, I've seen actually in supermarkets now you can buy hydroponically grown salad. You get those kind of hydroponic shipping containers that are set up for growing, and you can imagine you can stack them up, so they're very space efficient. They're completely pesticide free because they call it cooking the farm. So if a pest gets into one of these containers, they can just turn the temperature up and cook it and then reset the system. So they don't need to spray, they don't use chemicals. And I think lots of innovations like that we'll see coming online in the next few years, as we face all the challenges we talked about, from degradation of soil to more erratic rainfall. These kind of innovations will help make food more secure potentially. So I think everything is worth exploring. And even, at home, you can buy DIY hydroponic kits. Even places like IKEA sell little hydroponic systems. So yeah, definitely worth exploring.
Thank you. And they're also wonderful for those of us who live in apartments in cities or places with no outdoor space. So absolutely worth giving it a go. Unalka, this one's for you. One of our audience has written that I am surprised, brackets naive, at the level of use of chemical fertilizers that you spoke about, Unalka. How did that come about? Why were people using such high levels of chemical fertilizer?
I think it's because, well, I spoke about this in my first response to your question about our work and soil degradation. The use of chemical fertilizers goes back to the Green Revolution. Explaining it will take a lot of time, and it was a very political agenda. But to summarize what happened, we had a wave of people experimenting and recommending that chemical fertilizers were the silver bullet for agriculture, and that if we used chemical fertilizer, then the yield would increase, and the results were evident. Farmers were harvesting a lot more than they had initially been harvesting. So in the 80s and 90s, especially in the developing world, we see a lot of imports into developing countries, farmers using chemical fertilizers, and in many cases overusing the fertilizers. Fast forward 30 years, we have developed what, for lack of a better term, a drug addiction to chemical fertilizers. It's easy, it gives you quick returns, but I guess, like we say, anything used in high intensities is dangerous, and it's gotten us to a place where there's a lot of chemical residue in our soil. The soil is degraded, and we are now realizing that slow is sometimes the quickest way to get there. So using natural farming inputs is a safer way to farm. It might not give us the quick yield that chemical inputs do, but it does give us sustainable yields. Yeah.
Thanks, Janelka. And I'd like you to just stay on for a moment, because this next question is one that both yourself and Tom can answer. In general, do you feel that the techniques of regenerative sustainable farming and the vision to change the way we farm are becoming more widely adopted? Or do you still find resistance to these concepts, either from the farmers themselves or the systems in which they exist?
I would say that a lot of farmers are aware that chemical inputs are dangerous, and we see this even outside of the farming communities. People are worried about what they're eating, whether it's organic or not, and farmers are also noticing that their yields are decreasing because of too much chemical use. What we're noticing, as much as there's increased awareness about regenerative agriculture, what we're noticing in the countries we work in is that farmers are afraid of transitioning to regenerative agriculture because they assume that if they transition, their yields will decrease. So it's a case of trying to wean farmers off of the concept that chemical fertilizers are the solution. It's working to convince farmers and demonstrate to farmers that regenerative agriculture, as much as the transition initially is slow, so when a farmer transitions from chemical use to regenerative practices, the first 3 years of their yields will be slightly lower, but after 3 years, we see a drastic increase in yields. So convincing farmers to transition is hard, but they are aware that something has to change.
Thanks, Anelka. I'm going to sort of address the same question to you, really, Tom. Are you finding that, obviously your clients come to you because they like what you do, but in the gardening and landscape design sector in general, is the idea of resilient, sympathetic landscaping gaining momentum, or are you still finding there are people who staunchly want to grow roses and begonias in an arid climate?
Well, actually, I'd start by just drawing parallels to the horticulture industry. Everything Anelka was saying, you know, the overuse of chemicals, the over-reliance on pesticides, the kind of promised silver bullet of just nuking everything, you know, quick fix for quick wins, doesn't sustain in the long term. And I think it's a very similar world in that people are now, you know, growers, nurseries, designers, everyone's kind of coming round to the realization that this promise of fast results and you know quick wins just was so oversold and so unsustainable. And I think there's so many parallels in so, you know, across so many sectors, that I do think there is a kind of collective awakening happening in humanity, that we have been really abusing the planet and not, you know, just kind of going for I suppose like quantity and, you know, speed and not really slowing down to kind of be more in tune with nature. So I think in a similar way, you know, the transition is slow. You know, they're kind of persuading people not to just spray their garden if they see an outbreak of pest. You know, waiting and just seeing what happens. The ecosystem will rebalance if you allow it time. And it's kind of like we were saying earlier, you know, if you're happy to have a few nibbled leaves, you know, is that the end of the world if you see a few plants that have been a bit chewed? You know, and it's quite interesting watching a caterpillar emerge, or, you know, seeing what eats what in the garden. You know, that can be really great for kids. So I think because of the way I position myself, the kind of clients that we have are more aware and are more interested in organic techniques and you know, not overusing chemicals. But I think as a more kind of broad picture, it's still in transition, but I think it is moving. And it's really interesting to see, you know, companies like Wild Farmed in the UK who are you know, now in major supermarkets, a regenerative grain company making bread and you know, doing really well. So I think there's a kind of swing towards that way of thinking, and I hope it will gain momentum over the next few years.
Thank you, Tom. As you say, it's an exciting time for the transition to more sympathetic growing and gardening, allotmenting, farming. And I think we can all do a lot to champion that and form impressions at a time when people are open to ideas. And unfortunately, that's about all we have time for right now. A huge thank you to Anelka and Tom for taking the time to join us this afternoon. To our audience, thank you for being here too. I hope you've all picked up some ideas and perspectives, as well as some practical tips for how we can better look after green spaces in ways that make the most of these valuable, finite resources we have. If you want to learn more about our work at Practical Action or Tom's work, there are some useful links in the chat. But for now, I wish you all a great rest of the evening and plenty of juicy worms in your gardens. Thank you everyone for being here. It's been great.
Thanks.